From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
There were hints an attack was coming. Last week, the US moved what it called non-essential staff from parts of the Middle East around Iran.
There was a partial evacuation notice, a voluntary evacuation.
The UN's nuclear watchdog, for the first time in 20 years, censured Iran for breaking rules intended to stop them ever developing nuclear weapons.
The nuclear watchdog is saying that Iran has essentially doubled its stockpile of near-bombs-grade fuel.
And even Iran themselves announced they were ready with a counterattack or preemptive strike if Israel tried anything.
به ایران اجازه غنیسازی نمیدیم این غلط زیادی است. کسی منتظر اجازه این و اون نیست.
At the end of last week, Benjamin Netanyahu, to all intents and purposes, was planning to go on holiday. He was going to spend the weekend on Israel's northern coast, his spokesperson insisted, ahead of his son's wedding on the Monday. Before that, Netanyahu paid a visit to the Western Wall in Jerusalem's Old City. Dressed in his shawl and yarmulke, he followed the centuries-old tradition of leaving a prayer written on a piece of paper. His was taken from the book of Numbers, chapter 23, verse 24. Behold, the people shall rise up as a great lion and lift up himself as a young lion. He shall not lie down until he eat of the prey and drink the blood of the slain. Unlike everyone else praying at what's sometimes called the Wailing Wall, a site of mourning for Jews for the now destroyed temples that once stood there, Benjamin Netanyahu was planning destruction of his own. Operation Rising Lion would soon be in motion, symbolising the Lion of Judah, perhaps, or the Lion of a pre-revolution Iran, a revolution Netanyahu is surely trying to reverse. Either way, in the early hours of Friday, with the help of Mossad agents snuck into Iran and Israeli missile launchers pointed at it, military top brass were assassinated, retaliatory firepower was targeted, as were nuclear scientists asleep in their homes, and the sensitive nuclear enriching sites they worked at. As we record this, Israel say 24 of their civilians have been killed, Iran say 224 of theirs have. The Middle East is as close to regional war as it has been in decades. But has it worked in Israel's aim of killing off Iran's nuclear ambitions? Or has it made Iran even more sure of the need for them? The story today: why Israel and Iran are at war. In terms of what's unfolding at the moment in the Middle East between Israel and Iran, what order of magnitude are we talking about here?
I guess it depends on how you want to qualify that, because the sort of suffering, the levels of human casualties in the war in Gaza are obviously far, far higher and horrific. But Gaza is still, albeit a horrific war, a localised war. This is already a state-on-state war, two countries fighting each other, and they're fighting each other over nuclear weapons. That is the worst crisis the Middle East has seen probably since Iran came about 45 years ago. So on the scale of 1 to 10, I think we're on an 8.5 to 9 now, because the sheer ramifications of what could happen if this does go wrong, if this ends up worse than anyone could possibly think or hope, are truly horrific. My name is Tom Newton-Dunn. I work for The Times, and I'm one half of the General and the Journalist podcast.
Take us back. When did Operation Rising Lion start? What happened?
Well, it began in the early hours of last Friday morning.
Moments ago, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a targeted military operation to roll back the Iranian threat to Israel's very survival.
A blinding flash as waves of explosions blast Iran's capital overnight.
Israel has launched what it calls a preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear facilities and other military targets.
Here, a terrified Iranian woman films from her window, then down on the street. They are hitting. They hit 3 or 4 back to back, she says.
Dozens of targets have been hit across Iran, striking long-range missiles and targets related to the country's nuclear program.
an extraordinary barrage, a really wide scale of Israeli attacks on Iran, missiles launched from the ground, from fighter aircraft, taking out a whole range of targets, not just going after the nuclear infrastructure, but going after leadership and a huge array of other Iranian defensive capabilities.
Incredible. Some images showing individual apartments in building blocks targeted clearly because there was, some kind of nuclear scientist there that they wanted to take out. So quite precise.
Yeah, there was. So there was 3 targets really in all this. The nuclear infrastructure, dismantling their ability to build nuclear weapons, their plants. There was Iran's air defences, Iran's ability to fire back missiles. Those were taken out on the ground before the first strikes even came in. And then there was the leadership. That was the really interesting part, taking out some very senior commanders, personnel who would be in charge of responding to this Israeli attack, which the Iranians had some inclination would be coming at some odd stage. And a very brilliantly put together military operation. The way they sucked various commanders into being in places, into bunkers, after one of their mates was taken out by a missile in his apartment block, and then they hit the bunker itself. An extraordinarily detailed and well-executed operation so far.
How long would this kind of thing have been in the planning, do you think?
Many years. I mean, some elements of this would have been planned for over a decade, 2 decades even, because the Israelis knew about the Iranian nuclear plants in Natanz, in Isfahan, for example. So they'd been studying their plans for ages in terms of how to get at them and attack them. In terms of attacking the commanders, that involved studying their movements, spies on the ground in Tehran, Mossad agents or people Mossad are paying, Iranians they're paying. So this would have been a rolling plan that the Israelis have been wanting to do for years, if not decades now, which have been polished, improved, right up to the day before they press the button to go on it.
What has the Iranian response been like? What have they fired back?
So interestingly, the Iranians have had to respond with something because it's a matter of national pride. The Iranian regime, the Ayatollah, has to show his people he can retaliate to such an extraordinarily large attack on his people, on his country.
Inshallah, با قدرت عمل خواهد شد و با اونها مماشاتی نخواهیم کرد.
So far, the Iranians have fired a whole load of missiles back and drones. That was very much expected. And interestingly, quite a few of those have actually got through Israel's Iron Dome protection system, which is an extremely well-devised system of anti-air, anti-missile batteries to shoot these sort of stuff down. But they have got through, and they're hitting suburbs in Tel Aviv, they're hitting suburbs on the Israeli ports, and they're doing a little bit of damage. But so far, the Iranian response has been limited to just that, to throwing missiles back at Israel.
Let's zoom out slightly, literally geographically on this. Looking at Iran, looking at Israel, why are they enemies? Why have they been enemies for so long?
I think quite simply because Iran has vowed to eradicate Israel off the face of the earth, and the Ayatollah's regime, the fundamentalist Shia extremist regime, which took power in 1979 with the downthrow of the Shah, have been explicit. They view Israel as having no right to exist, and their game plan, almost their constitution really, the fundamentalist regime, is to stop Israel existing. And this was a pretty common view, actually, throughout the Middle East. The Syrians, a lot of Arab countries didn't like Israel. A lot have since broken bread and made peace with Israel after various wars in the 70s and 80s. But the Iranians are the one nation left who are really hardcore and really just don't believe in Israel's right to existence. And they say it quite openly.
And also we're putting their money where their mouth was in terms of that, and the funding of various proxy groups around the region to annoy Israel, destabilise Israel where they could.
Hamas in Gaza, who run Gaza, as we well know, Hezbollah in Lebanon, these are absolutely groups funded, set up, trained, armed by Iran to do the state of Israel real damage. The Houthis as well in Yemen is another one.
So if you're Israel, for a long time the fear has been Iran adding to its arsenal a nuclear bomb. And yet, back in 2015, there was an international agreement which put that fear on ice? What actually happened there with the JCPOA?
The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
The very one.
And not many people can conjugate that one, Lee. So that was painstakingly put together by President Obama. President Obama's presidency, all 8 years of it, his main foreign policy obsession, if you like, was to not let Iran get to this stage where they had a weapon that was nuclearized that they could then fire. He went down the diplomatic route through years of negotiation to finally come up with this thing called the JCPOA, which Iran agreed to. Brits, the French, also very much involved in it, Germany too. And what it effectively was a deal that persuaded Iran to remove all their enriched weapons-grade uranium. You need to enrich uranium to 60% purity for it to be in the realms of weapons-grade, actually a bit higher than that. But the Iranians under the deal would remove all of that. All of that would go, and they would retain only a very tiny amount of enriched uranium, which they could then keep on using for civilian purposes. And it was put together, signed in 2015, and then finally put into place in 2016. In exchange, the sanctions would be released on Iran, and they would be gently and slowly welcomed back into the world community. But crucially, no part of this deal would make Iran have to publicly renounce having an ambition to build a nuclear bomb. They would just have to put the steps into place to make that so.
And Donald Trump, who was elected in 2016, took office in 2017, didn't like the look of that, thought it was too weak, ripped it up.
He did, and prime ministers of Israel consecutively, including the current one, Benjamin Netanyahu, had always opposed this. They said it didn't go far enough, and what it had to do was force Iran to wholly and completely renounce any form of nuclear ability so they never could build a nuclear bomb. So Trump didn't like it, Netanyahu didn't like it, and in 2018, a couple of years into Trump's presidency, he ripped it up or certainly pulled the US out of the JCPOA. Pretty soon afterwards, the Iranians started enriching uranium again and completely disobeyed its terms too. Ironically, quite a lot in the JCPOA is precisely the sort of deal that Donald Trump has previously been, for much of this year, trying to implement.
Yes, because now he's back in office for a second term. This is still an issue, that deal not fully enforced, as you said. So what, was he all of a sudden converted to the idea of a diplomatic route to stopping Iran having a nuclear bomb?
Well, he said quite clearly, in fact, he wrote to Ayatollah Khamenei in the very first week of his presidency in January. It was absolutely front and center of his foreign policy agenda.
You said they cannot have a nuclear weapon.
Yeah. Well, there are two ways Iran can be handled, militarily or you make a deal. I would prefer to make a deal because I'm not looking to hurt Iran. They're great people. I know so many Iranians from this country.
Other things at the time were happening. We were thinking about his plans on immigration and tariffs, etc. So we didn't pay much attention to this, but he made it front and center. And it was actually the Obama threat. It was, let's sit down and do a deal here. But in Trump language, if you don't, we're going to wipe you off the face of the earth and you'll never know such violence and punishment coming your way. So he has been very keen to do this. He appointed Steve Witkoff, his New York City property developer.
Man with many jobs.
Well, his first job was actually the Iranian deal. Then he got Gaza. Then he got Ukraine. He got them loaded on him. But his very first job was actually try and sit down with the Iranians to try and thrash out a deal.
And thinking about why the Israelis have unleashed this barrage of attacks on Iran's nuclear infrastructure and much else besides recently, the progress of those talks is one of the reasons why, isn't it? Because they weren't necessarily close, but they were about to be in their 6th round of talks hosted by Oman. Why is that something that Israel would have been scared about? Donald Trump this time trying to strike a deal.
And I think the timing of the talks, what was going on in progress of talks is absolutely fascinating here and must have contributed in some way to Benjamin Netanyahu's decision-making if you look at what was going on. Steve Witkoff saying, I think there's a space here where we could allow the Iranians to keep some very small amounts of enriched uranium for civilian purposes. That's what Netanyahu was so annoyed about. But the Americans, Steve Witkoff, clearly thought that was the only path through to get that deal. Now, that wouldn't have worked for the Israelis at all, because for the same reason that Netanyahu opposed the JCPOA in 2018, it allowed Iran at least some semblance, some base of a nuclear capacity, which they could then go on to build. And as far as Israel is concerned, this has to be an end to the threat, full stop. They cannot be allowed to have any form of nuclear capacity that they could then weaponize whatsoever.
In recent months, Iran has taken steps that it has never taken before, steps to weaponize this enriched uranium. And if not stopped, Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time. It could be a year, it could be within a few months, less than a year.
So if the Israelis saw the peace talks going in one certain way, they could easily see some sort of situation in a week or two's time, a month's time, where the Iranians and the Americans had said, we've got a deal. here it is, all in place, and after that, it would have been very hard indeed for the Israelis to attack. So that is a very good political reason. There are many others as well, in terms of timing, Iran's depleted military abilities, its proxies wiped out, but the timing of something that could have happened diplomatically, which really wouldn't have helped the Israelis, I think is crucial here.
Well, let's just delve into some of those other reasons, because you mentioned there Iran and its proxies are depleted. Because of Israel, arguably, over the last, year and a bit, what they've been doing. Explain what happened there.
The Iranian regime is militarily at its weakest in 45 years. Reasons being, all its allies are either gone or decimated. President Assad, big strong ally of Tehran, gone, disappeared from Syria, living somewhere in a suburb of Moscow.
Former President Assad, I should say, and his family members have received political asylum from the Kremlin for humanitarian reasons.
Hamas, very, very badly weakened by the now almost 2-year-long Israeli attacks on Gaza, and Hezbollah in Lebanon, the third Israeli proxy, if you like, also very, very badly depleted. You remember this, exploding pagers, all the Israeli strikes on Hezbollah commanders and foot soldiers in southern Lebanon.
Security officials in Lebanon say that dozens of people have been injured after their pagers exploded in what's described as one of the biggest security breaches the group has faced in nearly a year of war with Israel.
And the Houthis also having get a fair kicking from the Americans over the last couple of months. So Iran doesn't like fighting back militarily, doesn't like meeting tanks with tanks, missiles with missiles. Instead, they have their proxies do it for them, and arguably they can do us a lot more damage. They're a lot closer to Israel than the Iranians. They're right on their borders. But they were desperately weakened, so there would have been no other better time for the Israelis to do this.
We also had, to complicate your JCPOA, with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. They last week came out with quite a sort of bombshell report saying what?
The IAEA have been monitoring Iran's nuclear weapons development systems for many, many years now. Sometimes they're allowed in, sometimes they're not. But they have remote sensors, they can detect what's going on. And undoubtedly, in the last 6 months, really since Donald Trump's election, the Iranians have purposely speeded up their nuclear weapons program. And a couple of weeks ago, the IAEA put out a warning to say Iran is now really going quite far and we're getting quite worried about this.
New report by the IAEA says Iran has further increased its stockpile of uranium enriched to near weapons-grade levels.
In fact, Iran may have enough fuel for 9 nuclear bombs. That's according to the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the global nuclear watchdog. Through the years, Iran has insisted that its nuclear program is peaceful.
And then last week, they put out their first official censor in years to say Iran now is in breach of its obligations under the nuclear proliferation treaties. They have enriched too much uranium.
Breaking news from Vienna, where the UN nuclear watchdogs passed a resolution that says Iran has failed to comply with its nuclear safeguard obligations. It's the first such resolution the International Atomic Energy Agency has adopted in almost 20 years.
Arguably, if you wanted an excuse to go, if you're Israel, there is one. There you've got an official, independent body saying, we've got a real problem here. But also, we could have a real problem here because Iran clearly were what's known as rushing to a bomb, rushing to break out and try and build something which they could use in defense of perhaps Donald Trump or Netanyahu. I mean, a Trump-Netanyahu axis for Iran is about the worst possible scenario. So it's entirely credible for them to rush to a bomb, and that's exactly what they're doing. They don't have one quite yet. They could still be in weeks, probably more likely months away from actually being able to perfect one.
Tom, we've been discussing Israel's attempts to try and attack Iran's nuclear capability, hinder its ability to fire ballistic missiles, and also take out some of its top brass. Looking at all of those three aims, how successful have they been?
I think very successful in some areas, perhaps less so in others. And quite interesting, we've got almost a fourth flank opening up now in the last day or so, which is the Israelis hitting Iranian oil infrastructure, oil terminals. Now, that was considered an area that was incredibly inflammatory if the rest wasn't, because that directly targets Iran's economy. pretty much their only ability to raise taxes is selling oil abroad and raise revenue. So that would do even more damage to the Ayatollah's regime. On the leadership decapitation front, they've been incredibly successful.
Israel has assassinated crucial leaders of Iran's military and nuclear institutions during strikes on Tehran, including the Chief of Staff of Iran's armed forces, Major General Mohammad Bagheri, and Hossein Salami, the head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard.
They've taken out the head of the IRGC, which is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, so the sort of elite hardline military force really that has run so much of Iran's response and certainly their proxies. They've taken out the army chief of staff, they've taken out the IRGC's head of intelligence, and they've been taking out Iranian nuclear scientists as well, civilians.
Behind me, you can see a building on which firefighters are still working after hours from the time when this strike took place. This is a building which is known for housing Iranian professors, including Iranian top nuclear scientist Dr. Tehranchi, who was the president of Azad University, and he was assassinated in this attack. Feridun Abbasi, the former head of Iran's atomic organization, is another figure which was killed in these strikes.
5 or 6 of them so far, the people who had the capacity, the knowledge to develop this weapons program. So they've been really successful. They haven't taken out Ayatollah Khomeini, very interestingly, because it was reported over the weekend that Donald Trump was asked by the Israelis, can we go for the supreme leader? Can we go for the Ayatollah himself? And Trump very firmly vetoed that. But otherwise, Iran now will be in a state of complete disarray. There is no one left in charge. All those people are now gone. They're having to appoint new people. They are desperately worried about their own movements in case they get another missile on top of them. So it's really destructive. So they've done very well on that front. They've also been really successful taking out Iran's ability to hit back. So their ballistic missile launchers, those extraordinary bits of footage we got last week, at the end of last week, of Mossad agents, Mossad commandos in the desert, flying drones onto those missile launchers. I mean, that brilliant sort of military operation doing that. So their capacity has been diminished. They're still firing ballistic missiles into Israel, and they're getting through the Iron Dome. So they still can fight back. So that's probably quite successful. I think we can probably give that a sort of 6 out of 10. The area which I think is really interesting, though, is the point of this entire operation, which is Iran's nuclear capacity. How much of that have the Israelis really been able to destroy? And the answer is we don't know, because so much of this is underground and really quite deep underground. So the Israelis say they've hit Natanz, which is the big nuclear enrichment site, if you like, and that was the first hit on overnight on Thursday night. And you can see TV pictures of Natanz in flames and a real mess. The same with Isfahan. That was hit overnight Saturday, another big area. Fordow was also hit, a big processing area and a storage area in the mountains. But the Iranians also know the Israelis can do this, so the really important stuff, the very sensitive stuff, not just the buildings where people sleep and the offices and where the pen pushers or paper pushers might live, but where the actual centrifuges are, which spin very quickly to enrich uranium, they're hundreds of meters sometimes underground, really far underground. And we know so far, publicly, the Israelis don't have that kind of weaponry that can get that deep. There's only one known bit of weaponry that can penetrate that deep, and it would have to be hit several times, one after the other, sort of an aerial pneumatic drill, if you like. And that's a bit of weaponry that the Americans have got called the MOP, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. And that's a 30,000-pound bomb. That's an absolutely massive bomb that can go through 5, 6, 7 floors of concrete. Still not 100 meters deep, but you hit that several times, you might get a bit closer. Now, the Israelis don't have that capacity. Only the Americans do. The Americans are not in this war yet. So, crucially, they would have done some damage to the nuclear infrastructure, but some reports over the last few days have estimated maybe only 20-25% of Iran's infrastructure for their nuclear weapons plan has been destroyed. And that just isn't enough for the very objectives of this mission.
And so the Israelis will really want the Americans to be involved in all of this. Thinking about Donald Trump's approach to foreign policy and the fact that he was pursuing quite vigorously a diplomatic route with this whole issue of Iran maybe having a nuclear weapon, is he anywhere near joining in on this? They haven't done so far.
And I think that is the simple biggest question of this entire thing. Will the Americans join this war? The Israelis would absolutely love them to. The Americans are already engaging in a defensive position, if you like. So American pilots, American Patriot batteries, already engaging Iranian missiles to stop them from hitting Israel. But they're not on offensive operations yet. They're not in any way targeting Iran.
From the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, tonight Israel took unilateral action against Iran. We are not involved in strikes against Iran, and our top priority is protecting American forces in the region. Let me be clear, Iran should not target U.S. interests or personnel.
And Israel would love that. Strategically be hugely useful for them to pull the Americans into the war. Meanwhile, Iran would hate the Americans to join this war, not least because they don't want this highly powerful ordnance dropped on their nuclear facilities, but also they really don't want the Americans in the Middle East again. For 10, 20 years during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Americans were all over the Middle East. That really wound up the Iranians, and they felt very threatened by that. So they will do everything they possibly can not to encourage the Americans into this war. And so far, Donald Trump is holding the line. He's been pretty contradictory, as Donald Trump can be. His Truth Social statements are on one moment saying, we don't want this to happen, the next saying, we warned Iran, it was all my idea in the first place. But of late, during the G7 summit in Canada, he's also now urging caution with the other G7 leaders. So that is very much a crucial element still in play.
And trying to distance himself somewhat from what's happening. Quote from Truth Social on Sunday, "If we are attacked in any way, shape or form by Iran, the full strength and might of the US armed forces will come down on you at levels never seen before." That doesn't sound like somebody about to deploy US aircraft on offensive missions or personnel on offensive missions against Iran.
Because Donald Trump is making a crucial dividing line here, which is, you attack us, we will come for you. If you don't attack us, we might just stay out of this war. And I think Donald Trump's whole role in this is another podcast episode entirely, quite frankly, but it's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's clear Donald Trump didn't want this to happen. On the very day, he was making statements saying, we need to allow talks to happen. We don't want Israelis to attack. And that night they did. So he looks a fool. The next morning he said, well, I knew this was coming. It was all my idea. And now he's sort of back on the fence again. So Donald Trump runs the risk of looking quite weak here because Israel, a huge ally of the US, has blatantly, it would appear, ignored everything he'd said. So if you like, he's got to kind of keep ahead of the shark on this, got to keep ahead of US public opinion, largely pro-Israeli, although that's been changing a little bit, we've seen with Gaza. So it's a very tricky ride for him and a very, very far from ideal situation.
Do we know what he actually thinks about this? Because on the one hand, you've got Donald Trump who's talked really tough about the influence of Iran in the region, but also you have a president who said only the other day that he doesn't believe in forever enemies and there are deals that can be done.
I have never believed in having permanent enemies.
What does he think about it?
Well, Donald Trump's administration is notoriously split on this. On foreign policy, it's huge divide. You have the hawks who still hate Russia, still want Iran to be properly neutralized. And then you've got the MAGAs who want America to be completely isolationist and don't want any part in any wars. And I think Donald Trump is personally more in the latter camp because if you looked and listened to his campaign rallies, as I had to, and I was covering the election for too many months, every single rally would be all about, I'm going to be the peacemaker president.
My proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and unifier. That's what I want to be, a peacemaker and a unifier.
There were no wars on my watch between 2016 and 2020, you say, it's actually not quite true, but certainly America didn't start any wars then. Absolutely, he wants us to be the peacemaker president. He wants to end the wars in Ukraine, in Gaza, and he wants to end this nuclear standoff in Iran as well. And ideally, he'd love a Nobel Peace Prize. It may be a very hard thing for him to attain. But a new war starting in the Middle East, a state-on-state war between Israel and Iran with all potential ramifications and escalations, absolutely not what he wants whatsoever, I don't think.
Best case scenario, first of all, if you are the quote-unquote West, if you're Keir Starmer, what happens in a dream world now?
In a dream world now, the shooting stops and there is some sort of truce brokered where both sides agree to stop throwing munitions at each other. I think that's quite difficult to see because it's been reported certainly that the Israelis have 14 days worth of operations that they've already planned. We're into day 4 or 5 now, so they've got a lot more to come and to throw at that. But that would be an ideal situation. And ideally, a situation where Iran doesn't break out from its military symmetric response, just throwing missiles back at the Israelis, and into an asymmetric response, which is, for example, targeting ships in the Gulf of Iran, potentially trying to close the Straits of Hormuz, which are only about 30 miles wide, sink a couple of oil tankers there, and suddenly about a fifth of the world's global oil trade, which goes through those straits of Iran, between Iran and Oman, that tiny gap of water, that would cause a massive economic problem. Inflation would rocket, the price of oil would rocket, and suddenly the world could quite easily be tipped into a fresh global recession.
What about regime change? Would someone not like it if actually, the shooting stopped, but the Iranian people rose up and toppled the Ayatollah?
And regime change is another really fascinating element into this, isn't it? Because it's no one's declared intention yet. Benjamin Netanyahu has given TV addresses over the weekend speaking directly to the Iranian people saying, now is your time to rise up.
Our fight is not with you. Our fight is with the brutal dictatorship that has oppressed you for 46 years. I believe that the day of your liberation is near.
Clearly, much of the world would love the Ayatollahs to go, the fundamentalist regime to disappear, because they haven't been any good to, quite frankly, anybody if you're in the West for a very long time. The problem with regime change, of course, is what do you replace it with? And we've seen this so many times before in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya. You topple a tyrant, a tyrannical regime, which Iran undoubtedly is, but you've got to have a new form, a stable form of government ready to take its place, or even worse could happen. Civil war, warring factions, and they could take control of Iran's, not just oil, but also Iran's nuclear facilities. And you could even get to a far worse situation than you have now. So regime change, ideally, yes, but I think a lot of Western politicians would be very, very hard-pressed to say they really want that before they can see a plan for it first.
Yes. What about an absolute worst-case scenario? How does this spiral out of control?
Well, worst-case scenario is the Gulf closes, you have an economic crisis because Iran starts sinking ships, and that entire massively important global trading patch of water closes down. But then worse, obviously, the conflict goes nuclear. Now, that could happen one of two ways. Israel is a nuclear nation. It could strike at Tehran. I think it's highly unlikely they'll do that first, that they won't do that as a preemptive attack. But we don't quite know how far Iran is in this development. Now, if you're the Iranian regime, if you're the Ayatollahs, you think, well, what have we got left? What's the only stick we've got left? Well, it was the stick we were trying very hard to perfect when Donald Trump got elected, building that nuclear capacity. And if those centrifuges, those storage plants deep under the mountains of Natanz or Isfahan aren't destroyed, you can bet your bottom dollar right now they have thrown everything they possibly can at it to speed that up, to try and get to the stage of nuclear breakout. And if they get to the stage of nuclear breakout, they just need to build a warhead. They don't even need to build a missile to put it on. You build a warhead that you can detonate, you put it in a suitcase, and you walk into central Tel Aviv with a dirty bomb, as it's known as, and you explode that. And then very suddenly, Israel will retaliate with a nuclear device, and then you're into a nuclear war. And that suddenly tips the world into certainly a nuclear holocaust, if not a full-blown Third World War very, very quickly. And that obviously is terrifying.
There's more from Tom in the Times' newest podcast, The General and The Journalist, available from all good podcast places. Do subscribe to us as well on whatever platform you're listening to us on. It means new episodes on this story and much else besides will be ready and waiting for you as and when they're released. That is it from us today. The producer was Hannah Varrall, the executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition were by Mao Lassetto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.